yeah. Because of Malcolm X, what made us best. They didn't want to see black man progress, and all along the way, black man has strayed, searching to find the way. I want to know, how long will it be till all my brothers see, the hidden brutality? How long will it be? Yes, yeah. It's been hidden from our eyes much too long. Good evening. I want to welcome everyone this evening on behalf of the Department of African American and African Studies, as well as the Islam, the Humanities, and the Human Working Group. I want to say welcome. My name is Wendell Marsh. I'm Assistant Professor of African American and African Studies here at Rutgers-Newark. We are just really thrilled to be here with Professor Zain Abdullah today. But before I introduce him and also give a little background about the working event in this group, I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors. This event is being held with the support of the Office of the Chancellor, but also with the full support of the Department of African American and African Studies, and also the participation of the Departments of Art, Culture, and Media, and also the Department of English. So thank you very much for the support for this event. So as I said, we'll be giving a few opening remarks about this event and the group. I'll introduce our speaker today, and we'll have the talk followed by a Q&A. Just a brief note about the Q&A. The chat is currently open, but if you had a question for the speaker for the end of the lecture, I suggest putting it in the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, so we'll be able to see it directly and pose it for the speaker today. So this event, Malcolm X, Islam and the Souls of Black Folk, is the conclusion of African American Studies Week, and it is also part of the series Islamic Matters in Africa in the Colonial Atlantic. So this series is one of the first activities of the working group here at Rutgers, co-organized by myself, by Professor Sadi Abbas, and also Alex Dika Segerman. And there are other members as well. You can see the link in the chat for more information about the working group. Just a quick note about the working group. We're interested in recognizing the conundrum that the humanities faces today, considering the privileged perspective of a secular elite Western male that has long defined the humanities, and wanting to recognize that even despite these origins, that the humanities remain a vitally necessary space to develop attitudes that moderate techno-scientific approaches to the world and promote critical thought in our current climate, which, as we all know, truth and even the very possibility of social life are under threat. So our working group seeks to develop and contribute to a transformative and reparative humanities. And this working group seeks to contribute to that. The theme for this year is Islamic Matters in Africa and the Colonial Atlantic. It brings together the study of material culture, visuality with intellectual history and humanistic expression. Through a focus on Africa and what we call the colonial Atlantic, the theme seeks to displace the so-called Muslim question from its geographic confinement in the Middle East and its ethnic association with Arab identity. This geographical focus will also create links between African studies and Middle Eastern studies, two fields traditionally separated by the historical boundaries of area studies. And also, we're bringing together people from different disciplines, art history, literary scholars, etc. And bridging these disciplinary divides and unsettling the conventional representations of Islam will invite new reflections, not only for Islamic studies, but really the humanities more broadly. So when the Islam, the Humanities, and the Human Working Group was brainstorming over a year ago potential speakers to help us think through some of the big questions that should animate the development of a transformative and reparative humanities for the university at Rutgers at Newark, very quickly, Professor Zain Abdullah became a person that we were interested in hearing from. Dr. Zain Abdullah is an associate professor in the Department of Religion at Temple University in Philadelphia. Trained as a cultural anthropologist, his current work focuses on the interplay of race, religion, and ethnicity. And his writings cover an array of topics, including Islamic studies, contemporary Islam, African-American Muslims, and Islam in America, along with transnationalism and many other topics and themes. He is the author of the notable Black Mecca, The African Muslims of Harlem. And it must be said here that this work is a reference. It is a modern classic. If you haven't read it, you should go read it. He's also the author of many peer-reviewed articles, far too many to list in this introduction. I will note, because of our interest in material culture and art, a relatively recent special issue of the Muslim World, which was historic for its cover, for which Professor Zain Abdullah was the guest editor. And the title of that was Black Muslim Portraiture in the Modern Atlantic, right? So at the very core of our discussions and our ideals, Professor Zain Abdullah is someone who we've been thinking about. And so we're just so pleased to have him here with us. And what makes it particularly meaningful is that as a son of Newark, he is no stranger to Rutgers. I hope he sees this as a homecoming. Especially for the Department of African Studies. The course that I currently teach, Islam and African American Experience, was put on the books, so to speak, by him. And he's a pioneer in the city and in the campus, a founding member of the Muslim Students Association. So, I could really go on in describing how special Professor Zain Abdullah is for us here at Rutgers-Newark and for our department in particular. But before I spend any more time gushing over just his presence, I'll leave the floor to him to share his research and knowledge with us today. Thank you and welcome, Professor Zain Abdullah.
Oh, thank you so much, Wendell. That was a wonderful introduction and generous and kind. Thank you so much. I will share my screen and we can get started. So to Professors Wendell Marsh and Alex Siegerman, to the members of the working group Islam, the Humanities, and the Human, to the sponsors, and to Christina Strasburger, who is the human glue working behind the scenes to bring together many of these events. Thank you for the invitation to give this keynote address on Malcolm X, Islam, and the souls of Black folks. And indeed, this is a homecoming for me. And prior to the beginning of this presentation, that's all I could think about, is that this is certainly a homecoming and an exciting opportunity to raise new questions, to come back home with a different set of thinking and a different set of questions. So the topic is intriguing for me for at least two reasons. First, the topic of Malcolm X has been honored by the National Book Foundation Award 3 times within 5 years. The young adult book called X, a novel in 2015, then Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention by Manny Marble in 2011. And the recent winner is The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X in 2020. As for the second reason, the autobiography of Malcolm X, co-authored by Alex Haley, who actually wrote most of the book, turning it into an American classic along the lines of the song Amazing Grace, based on the one who was lost and now is found. Since the book's release after the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, it still sells in the millions. It entered its 18th printing back in 1972. And the book sales between 1989 and 1992 increased by 300%. Alex Haley's son reportedly receives $30,000 per year, and this only represents 1/6 of the royalties for the book. What is it about Malcolm that for nearly 60 years, we refuse to let him go, as scores of new devotees join the fold among a diverse lot of rappers, writers, TV and film producers? While this question is timely and essential, especially for what it reveals about how we rehearse the past and contemplate our future, is not necessarily the question I'm raising this evening. I want to explore an old question in a new way, which is to ask, who was Malcolm X? Some ask, who was the real Malcolm X? So probing deeper into this question, I am asking, how did Malcolm X understand Islam in relation to Black suffering? First, Malcolm was a visual strategist. Maurice Berger would say, both in front and behind the camera. His early biographer, Peter Goldman, called him a media genius who understood how to use sound bites before anyone even knew what that term meant. He would even orchestrate media shoots for photographers, making their job much easier, according to one journalist, especially given their task to cover a radically different activist group for their magazine or newspaper. Even this seemingly simple portrait of him, the one I chose for my lecture while he was overseas during the final year of his life, tilting his ring to show its star and crescent symbol representing Islam, makes the photo resonate with the viewer and accent his religious voice. Part of my lecture title comes from the book, The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, published in 1903. Du Bois was a towering intellectual and consummate activist whose book Souls continues to be a classic of American and African-American literary history and a cornerstone of sociology for 119 years. Some of the essays in the book had already been published in popular periodicals like the Atlantic Monthly. But when approached by a publisher to make a collection of his articles for a book on race in America, he flatly refused. His concern was that the various essays would not mesh together. In fact, he later called them fugitive pieces. But he agreed to publish the book under one condition, that he be allowed to write 5 new essays. Many scholars of Du Bois, perhaps most of them even, feel that he was anti-religion, based on tirades against religious writings that rely on the supernatural for addressing social ills, not to mention his heavy criticism of the so-called Black church. But as his biographer, Jonathan Cahn, argues, 4 out of the 5 essays he adds are deeply religious in tone. In fact, Du Bois altered the title of the first chapter from its original essay, which appeared in 1897, as Strivings of the Negro People, by adding the word spiritual. So it became the spiritual strivings of the Negro people. He also included a new conclusion, the afterthought, as it was called, which adopted the language of prayer, beginning with, "Hear my cry, O God, the reader." In his The Forethought, which is the preface or the opening of the book, he writes that his goal is to capture the spiritual world in which 10,000 Americans live and strive. He continues saying, "Before each chapter stands a bar of the sorrow songs, some echo of haunting melody from the only American music which welled up from Black souls in the dark past." Du Bois plays the entire saga of race and American life to the musical rhythm of his religious vocabulary, focusing on the slave spirituals as a way to capture the fits, the false starts, the jubilation, and the poetry of Black souls. This is what we love about this little book, The Souls of Black Folk. It is also what we love about Malcolm. It is not just what Malcolm said, but how he said it, with his stark, in-your-face Jeremiad rage, damning social conditions in the poetic meter of a prophet on high. The Souls of Black Folk was one of the major books Malcolm read while in prison before his release in 1952. And his razor-sharp style resembles it. In response to the murder of Ronald Stokes by LA police officers, an excerpt of Malcolm's speech on May 5th, 1962 illustrates cadence, rhythm, and critique. Let's listen.
Who taught you, please? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate? You should ask yourself, who taught you to hate being what God made you?
Now, Malcolm, like Du Bois and Souls, brings together race and religion when he talks about the race you belong to and the God who made you. So we return to my earlier question. How did Malcolm understand Islam in relation to Black folk and human suffering? First, we must understand the Black religious worlds that birthed Malcolm and how he defined it as that old-time religion. In a famous speech, Message to the Grassroots, Malcolm denounced what he called these old religious Uncle Toms, associating Christianity with Black suffering. Islam, in contrast, is a good religion, Malcolm argued, saying that Islam is the natural religion of Black people. In fact, he says, that's that old time religion. That's the one that Ma and Pa used to talk about. As a minister in the Nation of Islam, or simply called the Nation, Malcolm clearly saw the problem of Black suffering in both religious, or in this case, Islamic, and political terms. This was the old-time religion of Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman, whose birth name was Araminta, a different spelling of the Muslim name Aminata or Amina, suggesting her connection to an African Muslim heritage. Bishop Henry McNeill Turner was another one, prophetically proclaiming that God is a Negro in the late 1800s, fiercely striking out against racism in the pews and discrimination at the polls. They all inhabited a realm where the spiritual answers the existential call of the political. The division between religion and politics not only had no place, but this way of excluding the sacred from the social made no sense for a subjugated people. The spiritual and the political were a single domain, and this was the world of Malcolm X and countless others. This is also the world of religious Black nationalism, or what others call African-American pragmatic religious naturalism, a term best defined as a way of seeing religion not as either true or false, but as better or worse. By the late 1950s, the Nation of Islam's popularity grew as a Muslim movement, and Malcolm, as its national spokesman, came under attack and was heavily criticized by immigrant Muslims and non-Muslims for calling whites devils, which some viewed as reverse racism, and for advocating racial separation instead of integration, the stance of white liberals and most Black civil rights leaders. Not only was it considered reverse racism, but Orthodox Muslims were quick to label Nation members as heretics or certifiably not Muslim. For Malcolm, Islam was certainly a major concern for how he thought about Black liberation struggles. And it was equally important for how he was forced to negotiate its various meanings while defending Black rights, even after his expulsion from the Nation of Islam. Many assumed Malcolm outgrew the Nation, and that this would explain the reason he left. He had an awakening, they would say, either on his Mecca pilgrimage or shortly after his announcement to leave. Even Malcolm himself at times made similar statements, arguing that the separation was a result of his exposure to true Islam. A month before his assassination, however, he gave an interview and responded to a question about his break from the Nation. I didn't break, he said. There was a split. The split came about primarily because they put me out. And they put me out because of my uncompromising approach to problems I thought should be solved and the movement could solve. Reports even show how Malcolm made repeated calls to be reinstated after his 90-day suspension prior to his expulsion. Still, the complete break for Malcolm was much more gradual, a process that had begun sometime before his actual departure. In his 1963 Michigan State speech, Malcolm had already begun to publicly move away from certain religious and racial ideals found in Yaqub's history, the Nation of Islam's creation story. His insistence that Negroes were Africans deviated sharply from the group's narrative that Blacks originated from Asia. In fact, Malcolm would later claim that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad did not promote any sort of African consciousness, challenging his audience, saying, find one word in his direct writings that's pro-African. Malcolm announced his official departure from the nation in 1964 on March 8th. 11 days later, he stated, I believe in the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but I feel I can best expedite his program by being free of the restraint and other obstacles I encountered in the nation. These restraints and obstacles speak mainly to the nation's policy of non-involvement in American politics, which included the civil rights movement. In contrast, Malcolm strongly wanted a direct action solution against racism and Black suffering. But the nation preached a millenarian philosophy and prophesied about the coming of a new world. In the meantime, followers were to remain steadfast and uphold the principles of Black self-sufficiency. 1 month before his death, Malcolm stood before a crowd in Harlem's Audubon Ballroom saying, I'm trying to get something organized that will enable us to take direct action against the forces that have been holding us back. By adopting a program of direct action, he had clearly rejected the nation's position for solving the race problem through divine intervention. Unlike Martin Luther King, who pushed for direct action as well, but nonviolence for attacking racism, and Mr. Muhammad's approach of indirect action, self-sufficiency, Malcolm argued for direct action, self-defense. While he clearly believed religion could be extremely useful for reforming bad behavior and social ills, like W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, and those followers of what he called that old-time religion, Malcolm believed religion must equally address social uplift. Shortly after leaving the nation, he delivered his The Ballot or the Bullet speech at King Solomon Baptist Church in Detroit on April 12, 1964. He excited his audience saying, keep your religion at home, in the closet. Keep it between you and your God. Because if it hasn't done anything more for you than it already has, you need to forget it anyway. 7 months later, Malcolm was more resolute about the need for Black people to embrace a pragmatic, direct action religion that would speak directly to Black need and oppression. I believe in a religion that believes in freedom, he says at a rally for the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And then he continued, anytime I have to accept a religion that won't let me fight a battle for my people, I say to hell with that religion. In late April of 1964, Malcolm made the annual pilgrimage to Mecca and visited Egypt, Lebanon, Nigeria, Ghana, Morocco, and Algeria. It was a strategic move, not only for his acceptance as a traditional Muslim, but for his effort to internationalize the Black struggle, urging thousands of African Americans to be ushered into the global community of Islam and gain a much broader platform. He believed that a Muslim connection with the Muslim world was not exclusive to converts alone. In a letter from Lagos, Nigeria, Malcolm wrote saying, the Muslim world is forced to concern itself from the moral point of view in its own religious concepts with the fact that our plight clearly involves the violation of our human rights. He continued to invoke the Quran, Islam's sacred book, as proof that traditional Muslims had a religious duty to fight oppression. And he added, no matter what the religious background of the victim is. For Malcolm, Islam had a major role to play in the Black struggle. The dilemma, however, was whether Black people and the Muslim world would feel the same way. Still, he believed that both spiritual and political forces would be necessary to improve the Black condition. Immediately after leaving the nation, he founded the Muslim Mosque, Inc., or MMI, and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, to serve both purposes. The Muslim Mosque, he said, would give us direct ties with our brothers and sisters in Asia and Africa who are Muslims. And the OAAU would set out on a program to unite our people on this continent with our people on the mother continent. In this way, the minority status of Black people in America would be overturned, and the struggle for human rights, reinforced by a moral authority that was international and a direct action agenda that was global, and this would gain majority support. Malcolm, however, expressed serious doubts that Blacks would embrace Islam, and he feared that traditional Muslims would not involve themselves in a sustained struggle against Black oppression. On a cold Saturday morning in February 1965, Malcolm lay in repose 6 days after his assassination. Ossie Davis eulogized him with some of the most exquisite words ever spoken. At the center of the tribute, he scolded those who would have us, as Ossie wrote, flee even from the presence of his memory. Our polite reply, he said, would simply be, did you ever know Brother Malcolm? Did you ever touch him or have him smile at you? Today, the answer to this question is anything but simple, as each of us recounts the Malcolm we have chosen to know. The poet Maya Angelou agonized over our portrayal of him and its impact on future generations, arguing that it would be dangerous to lose sight of his wonderful sense of humor. The real Malcolm X, wrote Jan Carew, the Guyanese writer and activist, was far more complex than the millions of empty words written about him. Alex Haley described how he had gathered some of Malcolm's scribbles, and in his epilogue, he included a letter from him that said in part, with the fast pace of newly developing incidents today, it is easy for something that is done or said tomorrow to be outdated even by sunset on the same day. During Malcolm's final days, his thoughts were in rapid transition, and he admitted to a reporter, I am man enough to tell you that I can't put my finger on exactly what my philosophy is now, but I am flexible. And yet, what amazes me is how quick we are to state with stunning clarity who Malcolm X was or was not. A mere 2 years after Malcolm's death, a Detroit forum was held to address misconceptions about him, and a booklet was published called Myths About Malcolm X, Two Views. On one side was a Black nationalist preacher, and on the other, a white founding member of the Socialist Workers' Party. Needless to say, neither side captured a man fully engaged in both the secular and the sacred, a man struggling to bring both to bear on the liberation of Black people. We rarely find this Malcolm, the one constantly wrestling with the sacred power of moral questions in what we might consider at times an evil world. Yes, he strongly believed that the Muslim world had much to offer the Black struggle, an argument already made in 1887 by the Black Presbyterian minister and diplomat Edward Blyden in his work, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, a book, we can assume, not entirely lost on Malcolm. In closing, on the night before his assassination, his final words urged the Muslim world to uphold their full responsibility, since Islam represented brotherhood and unity for the human family. Even 1 week before his death, he wrote saying, "My first responsibility is to my 22 million fellow Black Americans who suffer the same indignities because of their color as I do. I don't believe my own personal problem is ever solved until the problem is solved for all 22 million of us." From the time he joined the nation until his final day as a traditional Muslim, Malcolm struggled to reconcile what he felt was a divide between Islam and the Black world. So far, there are over 40,000 reading materials on Malcolm X, with only one major biography dedicated to his religious life, and that was published 25 years ago. What do we think we know about such a deeply religious person in light of this huge gap in the literature? Who was Malcolm X? Understanding his best ideas about Islam as that old-time religion is certainly one good place to find out. It just might be that a deeper look into this side of him will reveal something about ourselves and perhaps discover the reasons we find ourselves so beguiled by him. Thank you.
Professor Zain Abdullah, thank you so much for an incredibly stimulating talk. I think this work that you're doing, and I presume it's a part of your ongoing book project on Malcolm, really brings together a set of literatures that aren't in conversation enough. I think the analogy and drawing out the direct connection with souls of Black folk and this idea of old-time religion is really, really a powerful way to think through the religious meanings and legacy of Malcolm X. So I really look forward to seeing this work develop and see it published. So we're going to have a Q&A. Please, if you have questions or comments, please put it in the Q&A box, and I will be reading them out as a part of our conversation today. So perhaps we'll start with the question from an anonymous attendee. Often scholarship about Black religious and intellectual activism frames the intersection in Judeo-Christian terms. Here, the person posing the question says, "I am thinking of the term social gospel. Do you believe Malcolm was invoking a social gospel using the Quran to encourage Black self-determination, or should we describe his use of the Quran in other terms?"
No, thank you for the question. No, absolutely. I think Malcolm was more than just what Isaiah Davis called during the eulogy a seed that we were placing in the ground. I certainly think he was a seed that actually is bearing fruit, but I think he was also a signpost. I think Malcolm actually is is someone who actually had initiated ways of thinking about Islam and in liberation struggle. So I think he was trying to actually impose upon the Muslim world to actually rethink the text in terms of an agenda against poverty, an agenda against injustice. And in fact, as we know, the Quran has its major theme really is about how do we deal with poverty, but also how do we address injustice in ways that will liberate and free people, so they will be able not only to sort of survive and strive in a mundane world, but also how they will be able to reach their spiritual heights. So Malcolm was not just interested in the political liberation of Black people, but he was also interested in the moral reformation of Black people, because he felt that, I would argue, that you can't have political freedom and liberation unless you are morally prepared to accept it. And so I think the two went hand in hand for that reason. I'm not sure the social gospel was also concerned in that same way, right? Unfortunately, as I mentioned, out of all the 40,000 texts that we have on Malcolm X, only one major biography that looks at his religious commitments exists, and that was 25 years ago, right? And so I think it's just shameful that we don't actually explore more as scholars how this man was sort of wrapped in the embrace of the sacred. And not just wrapped in the embrace of the sacred, but also someone who was trying to bring that power to bear on Black suffering and Black freedom struggles. So I think definitely he was trying to enact and invoke a kind of a sort of Islamic liberation theology, as it were, even though I don't like the word theology here, because I think he was, again, as I argued, he was definitely interested in direct action. And this was one of his frustrations with the nation. The nation was involved in indirect self-sufficiency. And that frustrated him. And so he even said at one point that he's going to use his ouster, the fact that he was sort of put, as he says, put out of the nation, as an opportunity to explore these other ideas about direct action. He didn't feel that the kind of direct action that Martin Luther King had promoted was the right one, because it was centered around the idea and the philosophy of nonviolence. Malcolm believed in direct action, self-defense, that Black people have the right, and not just the right, but the obligation and duty to defend themselves, especially when the state refuses to do so, or others are unable to do so. He argued that we have the right to do that. And I think organizations like the Deacons for Self-Defense sort of speak to that, right? They also believe in a similar way that we have the right to bear arms, and we have the right to defend our families, our children, and our property and our lives.
So if I could kind of ask a follow-up question to that, in thinking about what a scholarship on Malcolm that took seriously him as a religious thinker and a religious figure, do you see Malcolm X as a translator, an adapter, a innovator in thinking through his specific social political context? What is his relationship to kind of classical debates, even in Islam? I will just say that I think this concept of old time religion does a lot in thinking about how to place him. And so if you could elaborate on that, that would be great.
Yeah, no, thank you again for that question. I think this is a part of the reason why we keep coming back to Malcolm after such a long time. I think the way he was wrestling with trying to understand the role Islam can play for Black freedom struggles at first, but also the way it can play globally for oppressed peoples around the world, I think is exemplary, right? And I think that young people today are actually at that point, right? It's really no longer a striving for a kind of perfection of religious practice, even though, of course, that always becomes a part of the religious occupation, right? And especially when it comes to Islam, because Islam is an orthopraxy. And by that, I mean, it's about how do you get right the practice, the rituals, right? Unlike Christianity, that's more of an orthodoxy, sort of occupying one with the notion of what is the correct faith? What is the correct way to believe? But then, again, it's not to say that Christians don't practice rituals or that Muslims don't think about doctrine. But I think that Muslims are trying to understand today, even how do you sort of enact this mode of religiosity in the world? What does it mean to be a Muslim in the world today? Mm-hmm. Right, and of course we know the way the world is torn apart, the way the world needs to be repaired, as it were, as Jews would say, tikkun olam. How do you repair the world, right? I think Muslims at this point are reacting to a torn world, to a world that's in crisis. And I think Malcolm, more than many, sort of speak to that urgency. So I think he gives us a new way of interpreting the Quran as a sacred text, as he used it himself in his arguments for fighting oppression. And so I think that, I think he does definitely provide, let's say, an inspiration for those of us. I think it could be problematic though. And as Maya Angelou said, even dangerous, she used the word dangerous to kind of see Malcolm in a certain kind of way. But I think what's important is that we have to also sort of read the text along with him, right? And I think what happens is many people who are trying to understand his philosophy want to sort of enact it in a new world. It's the same way, and I use this example of sort of the whole bebop era of jazz. I mean, what's interesting about that whole jazz encounter was that people like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and Bird and others were, when they were engaged as musicians in the 40s, they were playing jazz looking forward. They were trying to strike out on new territory, right? And it sort of established new jazz ideas. After Miles and after Train, many jazz musicians began to look back on the old jazz musicians. And so they were marching through history, sort of looking backward. I'm arguing that we have to be careful that we don't sort of create this hagiography of Malcolm, create this kind of sainthood of Malcolm in a way that actually forces us to sort of remain in the same space. I think we're charged, as Malcolm did say, to the young people. And I think it's really instructive that we do sort of read Malcolm's message to the young people. And he said that I want you to have the courage to think for yourselves, right? He gave wonderful speeches about the youth needing to be independent thinkers. Again, and I think we'd be wise to sort of accept that message from Malcolm. My concern, again, is that we have sort of lionized Malcolm so much and created around him this kind of sainthood that does not allow us to think outside of that paradigm, right? He should be a signpost for us, right? But not an anchor for us. And I think that's the best use of his memory, Those of us who are scholars who are writing these books about him, I think sort of unpacking his religious sensibilities will give us new ways of thinking about religion and its role in a society and sort of its role in sort of an oppressed world, right? And I think that's the urgency that we have in producing more biographies of Malcolm, but more biographies that focus on the ways in which he understood the sacred and how we can understand it ourselves.
So we have a question from someone who plans on doing just that, it appears. Jimmy, I don't have a last name here, is writing a dissertation engaging with Malcolm's religious thought. He's writing the proposal now, and he says that in the literature, he's found this comparison of Malcolm's view of religion and politics with the ideology of modernist Islam, of Islamists, of reformers. Do you think that this is helpful, especially given the comments you just made about thinking of him and his relationship to history? But do you think this is helpful lens to see Malcolm through?
Well, I think what's important, and I think this is what I was trying to get across with Malcolm, is that his ideas about Islam were very progressive. And I think what we need to do is not, if we are going to write about Malcolm and Islam, we need to make sure that we interrogate meanings about Islam itself. In other words, we shouldn't sort of reify or objectify Islam as a religion. We need to be able to deploy Islam not as an independent variable, but a dependent variable, right? Something that actually is in concert with the way in which we move as people who are thinking about religion, something that we shape, and something that shapes us as well. I think what happens is we oftentimes don't interrogate what we mean by Islam. Right? We'll say Islam says, and of course that Islam is not speaking. Islam, we can't objectify it and make it into a thing that actually thinks, that actually sort of moves, that actually gives judgments, right? And so I think that whatever, I think your dissertation would be lovely to see. I think that you also have to interrogate not just Malcolm's ideas, but also interrogate how we are understanding Islam as also an entity in the world. The idea of Islam is an entity in the world. So I'm actually editing a book for Routledge called the Routledge Handbook on Islam and Race. And one major task that I charge the contributors with is to not just talk about race in the world in Muslim majority societies or Muslim minority societies, but I want you to also understand and talk about how people are negotiating what Islam means, right? What are the boundaries of the religion, right? The book now has 43 chapters that covers about 30 countries on 6 continents. And so I think that has always been a challenge for me as an editor, was to sort of push scholars, not just to talk about racism in Germany among Muslims or Islamophobia around the world, but let's not just talk about the Islamophobia, let's talk about the Islam part of Islamophobia, not just the phobia, right? So I don't know, I'm sorry if I kind of went off, but I hope that answered your question.
So next we have a question from our colleague at University of Michigan, Dr. Christiane Gruber. Thank you for your excellent talk. I am curious to find out a bit more about Malcolm X's relationship to the do for self rhetoric as economic empowerment via an Islamic worldview. This is a major theme in both the rhetoric and the visuals of the Nation of Islam, especially in the infographics included in Muhammad Speaks.
Right, yeah, no, thank you. Definitely, Malcolm, when you think about the Nation of Islam and its philosophy saved Malcolm X, and it shaped him and it birthed him. And I think what's important about the Nation is that it was one of the only platforms, one of the only platforms that actually combined race and religion into a singular domain, right? It allowed people to sort of interrogate both in that space. And Malcolm had the platform to do that there. But I think as Malcolm's interest in Black liberation grew, I think the nation's self-sufficiency, do for self, right? Self-sufficiency sort of was not enough for him, right? And he had to actually sort of rethink his philosophy, because as I argued, he was looking for an Islam that would also benefit non-Black people, not just converts to Islam. So he wanted to see Islam and Muslims benefit the world, no matter what your religious persuasion was, right? And so I think absolutely, I think he was influenced by do for self, but he was also influenced by no self, as they would say, no self, do for self, right? The idea of knowing self, I think, helped to inspire him to kind of look at Africa. I mean, of course, you know, he was extremely well-read. He understood African civilizations and that sort of thing. And I think he wanted to sort of expound and expand, right, the nation's notion of know thyself or no self and do for self. But the nation was I think, very insular in that sense. And so so there is the sort of like a departure between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam.
So our next question, oh, by the way, the person writing the dissertation is Jimmy Butts. But we have a question from Ibrahim Salam, who says, you brought up the fact that Malcolm X himself was not sure about his philosophy, presuming because there's an evolution there. With that being said, how do you think Malcolm X's way of thinking should be painted and taught in our schools? And I would ask self-interestedly at both at the university level and more generally at in K through 12 education.
Yeah, no, I think what's important about Malcolm's curiosity, his courage, as he said, you know, to the reporter, that I'm man enough to admit, he said, that I don't have it all figured out, right? I think that is a valuable, such a precious value to share with our youth, that you don't have to have it all figured out, right? This is a process of discovery, right? Being in college or being in school in the earlier years, it is about asking questions, right? And I think that you know, I think this kind of Socratic method of questioning one's life, questioning issues and problems, is something that we can take from Malcolm's life. He had the courage to say, you know what, I used to think that this was true, but now I think I was mistaken, right? And I will say that publicly, right? Now, I think he was also grappling with solutions and also grappling with a way to understand what his positions were as he grew and changed. I think he was impacted by that because he came to realize that Islam may not be the solution for all Black people, that all Black people will not convert to Islam as a way to sort of fight their own oppression. He also began to learn more as he traveled through the Muslim world that probably most Muslims were not interested in Black suffering, right? Much of what he actually was promoting was this link between sort of what Islam can do for the world and the way in which the Muslim world could actually fulfill its own obligation and duty to oppressed peoples, right? And so I think really, definitely, I don't think there's a problem with the fact that he was sort of searching. He wasn't sure what his particular philosophy would be from one day to the next. I think that was inspirational for us. I think we should embrace that kind of discovery and journey.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Our next question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, how did Malcolm balance the various Islamic influences at play at the time within the context of the Cold War, such as the Saudi influence, the Egyptian, West African, etc.? What can be learned from his approach given these kind of different poles of influence?
I mean, what's interesting? We've heard Malcolm say that he was not political. In some speeches, he would say, "I'm not political at all. I'm not a politician." He would even say, "I'm not even a student of politics." And of course, I think he was I think he was sort of admitting this for effect among certain audiences. But I think he was an astute political thinker, right? And in that, I think he understood also that you have to have a different agenda when you're on different platforms, right? And when you're in different kind of spaces. For instance, when he was in Saudi, he sort of talked about the power of Islam to sort of to confront racism, right? When he was in Egypt, he talked about Black solidarity, Pan-Africanism, right? And so in different spaces, you could see his language changed, right? I think he was negotiating these power dynamics when he was in Egypt, when he was in Ghana, when he was in Nigeria. And so I think it's important to understand how Malcolm was negotiating power and speaking truth to power in different contexts, and not feel as though he was not being sincere. I think he understood very quickly, the same way Elijah Muhammad did, in fact, that when you're trying to attract and sort of and speak to different audiences, you have to have different vocabularies, right? And so this is one of my arguments about understanding Mr. Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad. Oftentimes people will look at Elijah Muhammad and argue that, well, let's kind of see how Islamic he was. Was he being a Muslim, or was he a heretic? And so, I mean, when Elijah Muhammad was speaking to Black Christians, he had a certain dialogue there. He embraced multiple discourses, right? And he was sort of polyvalent in the sense that, and multivocal, in the sense that he understood his audiences and he spoke to those audiences. When he was talking to Black Freemasons, he had a certain way of talking to them. When he was talking to people who were Black intellectuals, and he even hired many of them. Many of them worked for the Muslim Muhammad Speaks newspaper. But he had a certain way of understanding how you need a particular discourse for each audience. And I think that's something that we could really learn from as we understand Malcolm's dealings and even Elijah Muhammad's dealings.
Thank you for that. So we have a question from one of our students in art history who asks, we were learning about the idea of appropriation and its use in Islamic art. So as we're speaking of it in this context, would you say that Malcolm appropriated the ideas of Islam and applied it to Black activism?
I think definitely Malcolm tried to put forth an idea of Islam as a liberation theology, right? As direct action. I think what he was trying to do, though, is find a way to convince the Muslim world that this was not a foreign idea. Direct action on behalf of people of African descent and their human rights was not a foreign idea, right? It's not something that he was just appropriating. But I think he was trying to convince the Muslim world that this idea was endemic, right? That it was a part of what it means to be a Muslim. And so I think that, in this sense, I think Malcolm was sort of looking for a religion that would allow Black people to sort of seek their freedom and their liberation. And I think he believed that Islam was that religion. Then again, he did say that if I cannot fight on behalf of a people, right, then to hell with that religion. So in other words, I mean, he was looking for a religion that he could sort of instrumentalize, right? In other words, use as an instrument, but at the same time, I think he genuinely felt that Islam actually was that kind of religion that spoke to the kind of old time way of understanding how sort of God fights on the side of the oppressed.
So, you've been doing such a great job with a range of questions that go in a number of different directions. We'll take just a few more questions before we wrap up. And one of the things I would want to invite you to reflect on is this week we were discussing in the Islam and the African American Experience course this moment that's sometimes called in the literature racial Islam. This kind of period during the nadir of American race relations and the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, that's in the midst of the Great Migration. And we read from our colleague Sylvia Chan Malik's Being Muslim, in particular the chapter on for Muslim ladies. And, as you know, one of the arguments that she's making is that, this image has been often used to illustrate established narratives of Black nationalism, of established narratives about kind of the dignity of that was kind of found in these new religious movements. But she proposes that kind of thinking from behind the picture, kind of seeing what these women saw, actually helps us understand the attraction of Islam in new ways. And so having been discussing that this week, I'm thinking about discussions around gender, which among certain quarters, increasingly, the scholarship on Malcolm is interrogating the way we talk about Malcolm as a representative of our manhood, right? This kind of masculinist understanding. And I'm just curious about what is your take on these emerging debates around a kind of gendered perspective on Malcolm, and how do we understand these movements which are so associated as being masculinist?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and I think that when we read Malcolm X closely, and not just read books about Malcolm X, but actually read his writings, I find that when we're reading his speeches and reading his letters and the like, I think we find a different kind of Malcolm in that, right? We are fortunate enough to have had many of his speeches transcribed, but also people who are finding more and more of his letters in archives around, and also letters that have been put on sale, auction houses and the like, but we actually are acquiring more information about the way he was thinking about these things. Clearly, we do find that Malcolm is leaving this kind of patriarchal way of thinking about religion, the thinking about women in the nation, or women in the world, in fact. And he begins to talk, after his departure from the nation, about women and women's liberation as essential for our freedom, right? Unfortunately, Malcolm didn't have much time after his departure from the nation. I mean, he only was on his own, so to speak, about a year and a half, right? And so we're not sure where his thought was going to go, but I think he left us with interesting ways to actually think about the valuable position of women in the world, but also religion in women in the religion of Islam as well, right? Scholars like Amina Wadud and others who have been looking at the Quran and actually bringing a kind of hermeneutics on the Quran that speak to a new reading, or let's say, for lack of a better word, the feminist reading of the Quran. I would rather say a womanist reading of the Quran. And she has, I think, sort of pushed us in many ways to sort of rethink what the Quran is actually saying beyond the kind of patriarchal kind of interpretations that have been sort of handed down throughout the centuries. And so I think it is emerging where Muslims themselves, Muslim women themselves, are sort of also doing their own kind of scholarship, like Sylvia and others. And I think Eula Taylor's book on women in the nation is extremely valuable because she gives us an inside view of how women were negotiating those kinds of patriarchies there. The other part that I think is important is for us to understand an organization like the Nation of Islam and what it was speaking to in terms of Black women who actually did not have the option of being housewives, for instance, right? And so we know that oftentimes, especially at the turn of the 20th century, you had these kind of vagrancy laws where even women could not be at home. They would come and sort of investigate your house to see if you were working or not, right? And so with that sort of American history, when the nation comes around and says, look, we want you to be the wife or the mother that you want to be, right? And we will give you a platform for doing that. On the one hand, many women actually embraced that wholeheartedly and welcomed that opportunity to do that. So I think that we had to be careful not to sort of read back on, right, the nation from our present position, the notions of patriarchy and sort of manliness, as it were. I think we need to understand it in the context of what people were actually striving to do in those spaces. Now, last thing I want to say about that is that the book I'm writing on the Nation of Islam in Newark has really sort of altered my thinking in many ways, because I'm talking and interviewing women who are just showing me how powerful they really were, and how much they influenced the Nation of Islam here in Newark. And so I think we have a kind of monolithic way of understanding the nation. This is what pressed me and forced me to write a book on the Nation of Islam that is regional. We need to understand what was going on at Temple number 25, Temple number 7, Temple number 14, number 11, or number 12 in Philadelphia. So I think this will give us the texture and the nuance that we need for talking about what the nation was like. Oftentimes we'll say, well, the nation was like this or like that. You can't talk about an organization like the Nation of Islam with over 100 temples spread nationwide as though it's one unit. And so what I'm arguing for, the same way that Black Panther studies actually started to sort of produce books like the Black Panthers in Mississippi, the Black Panthers in Oakland, the Black Panthers in Chicago, we need to begin to produce text and works that allow us to actually create a kind of segmented way of thinking about the nation and Muslims around the nation. So we need now books that actually look at each city, that also illustrate the way that city becomes a character in the way we're talking about how Muslims in that particular city understood the message coming out of Chicago, but also had to negotiate with that city what they were able to implement and what they were not able to implement.
That's so crucial, so crucial. So my colleague Alex Segerman asked for you to follow up your comments about Malcolm being a media genius as a visual strategist. So can you expand on how he incorporated images of Islam into visual media beyond the Star Crescent ring, other examples or general strategies that he deployed in doing this?
Well, sure. Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Yeah, absolutely. I think he was definitely, as Peter Goldman said, a media genius in the way that he understood either if he was being interviewed on various broadcasts, how to say the exact things to actually either irritate people or to make people listen to what he had to say. Because he knew he only had 12 seconds or so many seconds to say it, but he could do it extemporaneously. He could just do it right off the cuff, right? Now, in terms of the print media, he would commonly sort of make arrangements for photographers who were doing a story for a magazine or a newspaper to come in. He would set all the props up, and he would tell them, okay, shoot here. Okay, now shoot there. And so what some journalists would argue, they would say, we love shooting the Nation of Islam because Malcolm made it easy for us. He would tell us exactly what to shoot, where to go, and we would also get the content that we wanted because he understood what they wanted to shoot. And he would set it up that way. In many of his photographs, you check online, you see him sort of posturing, right? So in the photo that I showed in my presentation, the Life magazine article by Gordon Parks that was on the Black Muslims, which was a major article. He's having photographers take photos of him, and he's holding it up so you can read the title, right? He has the other Muslim behind him. You can see he's holding it up, like actually holding it like this, But Malcolm, of course, is unassuming, and he's trying to be unassuming, and he's sort of holding it that way. Another time is when he's on the podium, and he's actually answering questions, and he's holding something. First, this one instance, he's holding a Muhammad Speaks newspaper, folded in just the right way where you can read, Black people unite on it, right? And he's kind of holding it like this, as though he's thinking about his response to an interviewer. So I think he was always trying to orchestrate these visuals. He understood that the visual culture could communicate the message in ways that just long speeches just could not, right? One important part about the Muslim, about Muhammad Speaks, is that it used political cartoons in very effective ways. It understood that much of its audience may have been illiterate or weren't interested in a lot of reading. So they used cartoons that were political to get the message across. In fact, they used it so much, and they used it so well, that Amiri Baraka, this writer and activist in Newark, New Jersey, used that model for his own kind of newsletter. And in fact, when people came to him in his organization, CFUN, well, the Committee for Uniting Newark, they came with a newsletter, and they were sort of promoting sort of this Marxist ideology and Marxist theory. And he said, no. No one's going to read Marxist theory, Marxist-Leninist ideas. He said, but we have to sort of use, cartoons and other kinds of visuals in order to get the message across for people. So I just think that there are a lot of examples of that. And unfortunately, I've only come across about 2 or 3 articles where writers are talking about that. But I am also looking at closely photographs of not just Malcolm, but photographs of Muslims in America as what Paul Gilroy talked about in his book on Black Britain. He wrote a book called Black Britain, A Photographic History. And I think this is something I'm exploring in terms of my own work, is to look at these visuals. How can we incorporate photography as a way to tell a story on multiple levels that we couldn't do in writing, right? So anyway, I don't want to prolong the course. Thank you for the, for the
so
question.
these have been really great questions. There are far too many questions to ask. I will want to finish this with one question of one of my students. It touched on a personal note. How has Malcolm X's legacy influenced your work and values in life?
That's a very good question. You know what's interesting? I remember giving my first talk on Malcolm X, and it must have been right before, now I'm dating myself, right before 1990, actually. It was a talk I was invited to give by a public library for Black History Month. And so that began my serious thinking about who Malcolm was. Growing up, I hadn't heard about Malcolm X until much later, and this was after he had been assassinated. So he didn't influence me in terms of me becoming a Muslim necessarily, but later on, especially as I entered undergrad and then graduate school, I kept coming back to Malcolm as someone who was trying to figure out how race, religion, and ethnicity were sort of engaged in this kind of interrogation of one another. Right. My first book, Black Mecca, is a reflection of that. Really, I actually wrote Black Mecca as a way to understand what it means to be Black, to be Muslim, and to be of African descent. And as an anthropologist, I had to find a way to sort of have a population where I could demonstrate that. And it took me a while, it took me a few years actually to find the right population. And I found that population among West African Muslims in Harlem, right? And so I found that they were also grappling as Black immigrants with their own Blackness, as Muslims from the continent, right, with their own religion and African heritage. And I thought that was a perfect platform for me. And so to your point, definitely, I think Malcolm was doing that much more than I had ever really imagined. And the more I read him, and the more I sort of think about his efforts, the more I realize how important he is for anyone asking these kinds of questions.
And I can't think of any better way to close our discussion on Malcolm X, Islam, and the souls of Black folk. I think this has been a phenomenal presentation and discussion. And, I really feel encouraged to kind of take up the task of reading and rereading Malcolm and listening to his speeches and really thinking with and thinking through the treasure that he offers us today. I would, if the audience could join me virtually in applauding Professor Zain Abdullah for this phenomenal talk. We thank you so much for it. And also I want to thank the audience for joining us on a Friday evening. We are, we're strong in numbers, stretched out over time and distance. So thank you all for attending this event. Next Tuesday is the next event in our series of Islamic Matters in the Colonial Atlantic. There will be a talk by the archaeologist Mia Carey, who worked on a dig to try to find the kind of material remnants of the home of Yaro Mahmoud, who was a famous trader, a formerly enslaved Muslim who had a really remarkable life. And so we're going to hear about him. He also sat for two oil portraits that we'll discuss a bit as well. You can find the link. I think we're posting that to the chat. Please register for that, and you can attend that talk as well. So, so one final thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Zain Abdullah. Thank you for spending this time with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.